Hello beautiful people, welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria and today we are starting a new series on this channel. We are starting a new series that I've been promising my best friend Heather that I would do because she has been bugging me about it incessantly since she decided to do a full read. I mean, she's read some of the books, but not all of them, but a full reread of Jim Butcher's The Harry Dresden series. And I have read the majority of these books before. So I've read at least up to Ghost Story, if not up to, I think I read one afterwards. Like it's been a while since I've read the majority of these books. Let me see. Let me double check here. Okay, I definitely read Cold Days. Okay, so I'm positive. I've read up to Cold Days. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 books in the series. And there are 3 others that I have not read. But as you can see, it has been quite a long time since I've fully read the series. Now, I think I read Stormfront about like 2 years ago, reread it about 2 years ago, and started to read Full Moon and then just didn't get back into it. And so I decided I wanted to take a page out of Merphy Napier Reviews, or Merphy Napier Books. I know she has 2 channels, I believe, but I know she does some spoiler vlogs for each of the Dresden, I call this the Harry Dresden, of the Dresden File books. And I thought that would be an interesting way to give Heather all of the information and thoughts that I had on these books so she can just go and watch a video and then text me back her thoughts. But I also thought it would be kind of interesting, since I have read all these books before, to do a little bit of a prediction for every book to see how much I remember about that particular book and to make my predictions of how I think this book goes. And then once we finish it, go ahead and see everything that I got wrong. I also thought it could be interesting to watch each one of Merphy's spoiler videos to kind of give my thoughts. You know, kind of like having a one-way book club with her, I guess. I don't know, is that kind of weird? Anyway, I was thinking about doing that. But I guess we'll see. I haven't watched any of those particular any of her spoiler Dresden File vlogs just because I was planning on rereading them, so I didn't want to spoil the books for myself again. But with that in mind, this first book that we're going to read in this series is obviously the first in the Dresden Files series, and that is Stormfront. So as I mentioned, I've read this book at least twice, if not 3 times, but do I remember everything in it? No. So how we're going to do this, I will go ahead and read the synopsis, and then I will tell you what I believe I remember from this book, and then we'll get started reading. The summary of this book reads, Harry Dresden is the best at what he does. Well, technically, he's the only at what he does. That was a weird sentence. Well, technically, he's the only at what he does. So when the Chicago PD has a case that transcends mortal creativity or capability, they come to him for answers. For the everyday world is actually full of strange and magical things, and most of them don't play well with humans. That's where Harry comes in. Takes a wizard to catch a, well, whatever. There's just one problem. Business, to put it mildly, stinks. So when the police bring him in to consult on a grisly double murder committed with black magic, Harry's seeing dollar signs. But where there's black magic, there's a black mage behind it, and now that mage knows Harry's name. And that's when things start to get interesting. Magic. It can get a guy killed. So that is the synopsis, or the back of the book teaser for Stormfront. So what do I remember about the book Stormfront. Obviously, this is the first in a series, so we are establishing a lot about Harry Dresden, who is our main character, wizard PI in this series. So if you've never read the Dresden Files, and you will see this is an old copy. Look at these pages, man. And I got this from, I used to go to a used bookstore and work there too. I used to go to this used bookstore. I actually first read this book in a paranormal book club that Heather and I joined back when we were in high school, and this was one of the few book series that I continued with from that book club, primarily because we read a lot of paranormal romance in the beginning, and the only one that really comes to mind, the first one, was the J.R. Ward series, and that was not my taste. But this one definitely was. And I read this book at 16, so we're literally like a little over half, like double the age that I was when I initially read this book, which is kind of crazy to think about. So there's a couple things to know about Harry. He lives in a dark basement of a building in Chicago. So this is like a modern day. Now these books, again, the first one was published a long time ago, so, you know, modern-ish day Chicago. I think it's kind of interesting because since Harry's a wizard, magic doesn't work well with technology, so it kind of makes it easy enough for Butcher to keep it level, I guess, with like what's going on in the world, and keep it modern-ish because Harry's not going to use a lot of tech. So I think that helps the book kind of feel modern still, even though it was published like over 20 years ago. And I believe so, like it was either, yeah, it was like 2000, I think, or 2001, so it's been over 20 years. And let's see, what do I remember about the story? So a woman comes in to Harry's office, and he's excited because he hasn't had anybody, he hasn't had any jobs, and he's always wanting for money. As I mentioned, he lives in like this dark, dank apartment, and it's like the underground apartment like they have in New York and Chicago. He has a cat named Mister. I love Mister. Probably my favorite character. He goes to a bar, which I don't know whether the name is escaping me right now all the time, which is kind of like a magical safe zone. It's like a neutral zone. He frequents there. The mystery in question is pretty gory, and so there's a special unit, and his kind of friend, I mean, I feel like they're friends-ish in this first book, but they become better friends as the series goes on, and that's Merphy. She is a detective. She is a legacy detective, but unfortunately she's been put on this like paranormal supernatural unit, which means that her and Dresden have a lot of interaction with one another, and she's pretty skeptical about things, but she's not as skeptical as her partner is, and she calls him in when they think something paranormal is going on. And again, this is going to be a spoiler video, so I'm just putting that out there. I believe the initial case he gets called on, it's in this like penthouse, and there's these two people who are having sex, and like their chests are exploded. And so Harry is pretty sure that it has to be some kind of black magic, but he's not quite sure who could do it and how they're doing it. And in addition to that, there is a wizard council, and Harry's kind of been on their shit list for a long time, and they have these wardens who basically watch for any wizards doing black magic, because that's a big no-no. And they're convinced that Harry's the person who's committing these crimes because he is the known entity in the Chicago area. And as I mentioned, Harry has kind of a checkered past with this council. So they're trying to prove that it's him, and Harry's trying to prove that it's not. So there's a lot of things that's at stake. He's got, as I mentioned, this woman comes in at the very beginning who is looking for Harry's help, and somehow that ties all in together from what I remember. Some more things happen. What else do I remember? Susan is in this one. Susan? I think her name is Susan. And she is a reporter who reports for like a paranormal magazine. And her and Harry have a thing. And she gets involved and gets herself in bad situations. She's not one of my favorite characters, I'll be honest about that. Harry drives a Beetle because he needs to drive an older car. And it's got like different pieces to it because he keeps having to fix it because it gets jacked up. And then with the ending, now I don't remember who it was, but I do remember it's in like a house, like outside of Chicago. And there's like a big storm coming and they need the lightning to like propel the magic they're trying to do. And Harry has to go there and stop it. He saves the day, gets hurt, which is typical of a Dresden Files book, and he lives to see another day and go to another book. And that's what I remember, for the most part. So, yeah. Anyway, so we are gonna see how much I got right and all the parts that I'm missing as we reread this first book of Stormfront, and then we will go through. I will give my spoiler-filled review, kind of tell you what I got right and what I definitely missed, and see where we go from there. So let's get to it. Hiya. So we finished it. Stormfront complete. Also, don't mind, we are going to be moving in a month, so we started removing some items off the walls, if you will. But so we have finished Stormfront. I finished it last night, very late into the evening. And so with that, I was gonna give you my breakdown, but I thought maybe I will watch Merphy's video first.
But his specialty, he works for the police force as a wizard investigating supernatural crimes. That's way better! And he's also a private detective. So we could do private hires for, you know, supernatural issues or disappearances. So there are definitely some detective scenes, these things, because he's like, okay, yes, but if there's a demon on my back, then why wouldn't they be targeting the lead investigator for this crime? To the wider world, but
I just watched Merphy's portion of Stormfront. I didn't realize, like I said, I've seen that she posts spoiler filled vlogs for her Dresden reads, but I guess that's more recent. So I went back to her first Dresden File vlog and just watched the portion of her talking about Stormfront, because again, we were trying to see how much I can remember of these books before I read them, so I don't want to go into Full Moon with her video and kind of like tainting my experience of the reread for that. Not that she would, but you know what I mean. Like, I just don't want to like put ideas in my head, so I'm more accurate when I get to this portion of the video. So we finished Stormfront, and I really honestly agreed with a lot of what Merphy said. Like, she kind of hit the nail on the head of my thoughts of Stormfront. So I gave this 3 stars, which, I mean, I think, again, I read this when I was 16, so there wasn't even like, I mean, I guess you could have rated it on like Borders.com or BarnesandNobles.com. They used to do that all the time. Do you guys remember the Borders website? Anyway, so I guess I could have written a review there, but I think I did like highlighting, and most of the stuff that I did highlighting on were just like a lot of the story world building kind of plants that set up the world that we dive into in the Dresden Files, like introducing our reoccurring characters, introducing the things that make Harry Harry. I think of somebody who's read a lot of urban fantasy and paranormal romance from like the early to late 2000s going into the mid 2000s, they very much followed some of like that procedural detective kind of situation. So similar to this, even like Patricia Briggs or Anita Blake series early on, of there's a mystery, something needs to be solved, and with that your characters have like tells. So for example, Harry drinking like a Coke, or like him not having any type of heating or electric lighting in his apartment, and different things like that. That all plays into the world, but it also plays into keeping some things familiar for your reader and going into these stories, which gives them, at least at first within this series, that more like standalone vibe. But as tends to go with these more paranormal urban fantasy series, is that we as a reader and our protagonist tend to stretch further and further away from that norm as the series goes on. And I think as authors, they establish a lot of like what grounds this character in the beginning of their story. So as we get further and further away from that, we feel that nostalgia that the character's probably feeling. So, you know, things that I highlighted were like the introduction of Mr. and how Harry acquired Mr. and introduction of Bob. And I did write my notes, so I probably should try to bring this together more, but I did write a note in here because I did watch the one season series of the Dresden Files that Sci-Fi had, as like, see, as this book says, as seen on Sci-Fi, that Sci-Fi did back, when was that show come out? 2007. Yeah, I was gonna say, I definitely was in high school when it came out. I think it came out right around the time that I read the book. And I remember being really aggravated because they changed the type of being that Bob was in the show. So in the book, Bob is some kind of like air, not sprite, but air being, air elemental of sorts that's housed in this skull and can only be released when Harry allows him to be released from that skull. Otherwise he lives there, he resides in there and kind of works as like a supercomputer, a magic supercomputer. But in the TV show he was like a wizard who did some bad things, and like this was his punishment. I remember at the time being really irritated that they changed that and not quite understanding why we needed to change that. So I even wrote that note in the book because that just like was one of those things that stuck out to me. Overall, this first story, like the first mystery, and I think Merphy touched on this a little bit as well, is like, it's somewhat interesting, but it's definitely not the most interesting part of this book. I think that Butcher has such a great style of world building and writing where he's able to give you so much information on this alternate universe of Chicago where there is a wizard PI who is attempting to make ends meet and work within both the mortal realm and this kind of shadow version of it where like all the monsters do bump in the dark and try to live in a bit of a gangster noir style urban fantasy. And so I think he straddles like two worlds in this book, and it's kind of where I feel like some of the dichotomy comes into what people like about Dresden and what people didn't like about Dresden or don't like about Dresden. So I do feel, and I don't know if Jim Butcher said this before, but I do feel like a lot of the ideas of this come from that like noir detective kind of story with some of the stereotypes that we have of characters. With Dresden, like your consummate bachelor, he doesn't have like super healthy habits. He's always looking to make money because he can never get it to come in steadily, and you know, he's kind of like the pariah of the cops where they need him but they don't necessarily trust him or like him all the time. You know, we've got Merphy, who is the cop that kind of is the in for Harry. And I think, you know, definitely the largest flaw of this book is how some of the female characters are written in this book, and also just like Harry's descriptions of women and like the chauvinistic jokes and things like that. I think there's something that when I reread this book like 3 years ago, I was like, oh, I don't remember that from when I was 16, but now it seems blatantly apparent and kind of strange, and sometimes it's off-putting. I think of like also with Susan, of why I didn't like Susan. Like, was my least favorite female character, and I do think she is like the archetype of the reporter who's trying to get a story, but she's like using her feminine ways, but then she knows that Harry knows, and Harry knows that she knows that she's aware that he knows, and it's this weird kind of game. And then it's supposed to be, he's like, oh, women are so subtle, and I'm like, are they? Because you're like, oh, she's literally trying to seduce me, because that's how she usually gets her stories. So some of those things are kind of weird and not my favorite. I know that it does get better. I know that I even think between like the first half of this book and the second half of this book, I feel like you could see the characterization of our female characters growing a bit from when they're first introduced with both Merphy and Susan. So I do think that you even like in this book see a little bit of that progression, but that, you know, sometimes you get a little bit of the ick from that with Harry. And I definitely think it's not just a product of their time, but it's just something that I do see a lot of people commenting on it. I've heard a lot of people comment on it when they read the books. But again, I feel like where the hook comes in for these books is definitely the world that Butcher builds from the beginning, of just like throwing in things about the White Council, of Harry's background, which, you know, alluding to some of the things that happened and why he's like not only a pariah in like the mortal realm, but is also a bit of a pariah in the wizard circle as well. And just kind of that weird in between that he lives in, and also just setting up some of the other pieces that, as somebody who's read the majority of the series, you just kind of think of where they end up falling into the larger story later on in the world, and how so early on he puts those pieces into place so he can expand on them and bring them forth in later books. And from the reread, I think that I see from like a writing standpoint of the influences that Butcher had on how I like to write fantasy stories. Not claiming that I'm nearly as talented as he is at doing it, but just saying like I can see the influences of his style of writing, and also just how he's setting things up, and just linking that information, placing it there, making those connections, and just setting all these little things into place to really get us into some of the larger stories that are going to come into play later on this series. So I'm really excited to hop into Full Moon. I don't think I've done I think this is probably the only one that I've done like multiple rereads on now. When it comes to what I think I had right, I mean, I think I had the general idea of things correct. I definitely remember the house scene, or visualized the house scene. I was pretty sure that Victor was the person we were looking for, and I knew that those two stories were attached the whole time. I remembered as soon as the scorpion entered this story, I was like, I'm pretty sure that comes alive later on, and I noted that in the book. And then I was like, woot, I was right a little later on. Also want to say, like, I forgot how much miscommunication there is between Dresden and Merphy early on in the series, and how that like plays into their friendship, and probably like the will they won't they that many people feel between Dresden and Merphy. And so it's interesting to see that again, because I was frustrated with Dresden for not just telling Merphy and just making assumptions about Merphy's response to different things that he would tell her, and then I was frustrated with Merphy for also making assumptions on the things that Dresden refused to tell her and go like in a certain direction and then taking it out on him essentially. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, which I think is something that's pretty prominent throughout the series. So I'm expecting to see more of that. But Merphy is also still one of my favorite characters. I do see, like, as an adult, like, I wish we would have been a little more nuanced with her in the idea that, like, yes, she is a woman trying to establish her place in what's like a boys club kind of situation, but I feel like it's not as nuanced as I would like it to be. But again, I think that comes with age, time, character development, so I'm pretty sure, at least from my memory, that that gets better with Merphy and we get more solid in her just being who she is, and morphed by her experiences. But I am looking forward to reading Full Moon. I thought I'd have more like reveals on this, but really like Stormfront is kind of a standalone in a lot of ways when it comes to the actual plot. So I don't want to like give away too much with the other books, even though like my brain doesn't like initially remember all of them. Sometimes I need cues. But anyways, I'm gonna wrap this up. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any thoughts on Stormfront, feel free to drop them in the comments. If you made it to the end of this video, you can put like a lightning bolt or something like that. And if you feel like sticking around for more bookish and nerdish content, feel free to subscribe. I upload every Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays. And until next time, I hope you read a good book. I hope you find some joy. And most importantly, I hope you do something to make the world a better place. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!